What is a product backlog? The concept of the product backlog is a popular technique which is critical to Scrum. Now, a product backlog is a list of software features that you and your team intend to develop, and the product backlog begins as a big, unsorted list of to-do items, and then he gets more refined over time. The product backlog consists most of user stories, but the product backlog isn't limited just to user stories. You can include other things like work tasks, knowledge tasks, new features, enhancements, bugs, and other things like architectural work, technical depth, and so on. So, work tasks include things like setting up a production testing server. There are physical to-do items that aren't directly related to developing your product's features. A knowledge task is similar. It's a to-do item for things that needs to be learned. You might want to have a review programming options for your database connection as the knowledge item. And of course, bugs are simple errors in your production code that requires attention. Now please remember that user requirements go into the product backlog in the form of user stories. And the user stories are by far the most common item of the product backlog. When you write your user stories with your client, the first thing that will be done with them is they will be placed into this list. The product backlog is a Scrum technique, which also means it's an agile technique. That being the case, the product backlog should be dynamic and focused on client interaction. The initial user story you write with your client are gathered together and placed into product backlog. And there is no particular order to it. The whole point of the backlog at the very beginning is that it is an unordered list of all things which would ideally be built into the end product. And when you create each user story to be put into the backlog, make sure you will assign a unique user story identifier to it. And this is important because it gives everyone a frame of reference within the project. So instead of having to recite the content of each story whenever you refer to it, all you have to do is to reference a user story identifier. It doesn't matter what identifier you assign to any given story. However, a simple way to use sequential numbers. Assigning the first story you think as 1, a second user story 2, and so on. Now, once you have your list, the next thing for you to do is to ask your client to give a priority to each story. And then the client sorts the previous unsorted list of user stories from highest to lowest priority. The goal is to have the most high-value features listed at the top of the backlog and the least important ones at the bottom. And this will jumble up your user stories identifier, but that's okay. The user story identifier is more a tracking mechanism than a sorting device. And this gives a developer a sense of what's important for them to develop, and it also gives them perspective and focus. All they have to worry about is pulling tasks from the top of the backlog. It gives your client perspective and focus as well. By going throughout every user story in the project, your client is forced to think about what they need and what they want. This often leads to a dialogue between your client and your developers. So your client tells your developer what they need, and then your developer shows your client what can be done, given the technology and resources available. However, just because this dialogue can happen doesn't mean that it always does. You can get the client focusing only on prioritize the product backlog, while the developers focus only on estimated efforts of the implementation each user story. And then this creates kind of a fence between them. But in Agile, there should be discussion and collaboration. And this allows clients and developers to both understand the reason why a user story has a certain priority and why an effort estimate has certain value. And the best thing you can do is to try collaborate with your client as much as possible and allow your developers to communicate with your client throughout prioritization and planning. Okay, now, so you create a backlog with your client and everything is prioritized. All of your user stories are numbered and sorted from the highest to lowest based on the priority to your client. So the next step is to start planning your project using these priorities as your reference point. User stories are taken from the product backlog and placed into chunks of work, and we call that sprint backlog, which should be done in a certain time interval called sprints, just like in this picture. In Scrum, product owner is responsible for creating and prioritizing user stories, or product backlog items. They are responsible for making sure that the product backlog is up to date, and stakeholders, developers, may fill the product owner's role, but they must be a product owner who is responsible for changing the product backlog items.